So we are up to Daf Yud Amud Bet. We've been kind of trying to book a little bit over the last few days, and now we are in some ways home clear. So let's begin. The Gemara now is going to enter into a discussion of trying to understand little bits and bobs from the Gemara, from the Megillah, and those a lot of those lessons that are Megillah based will actually have lots of ramifications for other places in the Torah, but they're learned in the context of the Megillah. So let's begin. Very first words of the Megillah, as we all know, are Vayihi bimei Ahashverosh, and it was in the days of Achashverosh. We're on 10b. I'm not sure where it is in the Art Scroll English. If someone has a Gemara open, you can let me know. But it's 10b. I believe it's 10b1 or 10b2. The Gemara goes as follows: V'hivim Achashverosh. It was the days of Achashverosh, and what do we see in that instance? Says the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Levi. Rabbi Levi teaches. V'item Rabbi Yonatan. Some people say it over in the name of Rabbi Yonatan. We have this as a teaching all the way back from the Anshe Knesset Agdola. Who's the Anshe Knesset Agdola? Who are those people? So we discussed this a little while ago, where we said that the Anshe Knesset Agdola were a group of rabbis that were they were called the men of the Great Assembly, and they existed roughly towards the end of the first Beit Hamikdash through the time of the lack of the Beit Hamikdash in the first exile, and then back again in the beginning of the second Beit Hamikdash. So, as an example, the Gemara says Shimon HaTzadik was Mishayare, was the leftovers on Sheknes Tagla, right in the beginning of Masechet Avot. So this is a very long period of time, and it was the Anshe Knesset Gdola actually that made many takanot and gave Judaism a lot of the feel that we know today that comes from Anshe Knesset Gdola, including, as an example, the structure of the tefillot that also comes from Anshe Knesset Gdola. Okay, so this large group of very important rabbis from that time span, they taught us a very interesting idea, and that idea is Kol makom shneimar, every time it says Vayihi, eno ela lashon tzar, it only refers to a time of pain. Let me explain what that means. When we introduce a new idea, we could say two words. One is Vayihi, and one is Vehaya. So let me give you an example. Vayihi b'shalach paro et ha'am, and it was as Paro sent out the nation. So everyone asks if Vayihi is telling of a sad time, of a difficult time. Vayihi is inappropriate. It shouldn't say a sad time. Now, what would the other way of introducing that idea be? So Vayihi means and it was. What's the alternate way of saying, of speaking? They write Vehaya. Okay? Vehaya means and it was or and it will be. Now, what's interesting is Vayihi means usually backwards, and Vehaya usually means forward. I think we need to put someone on mute. All right? So, Vihaya means forward. So how could you substitute the word Vihaya for Vayihi if you meant in the past? And the answer is that we add an extra word if we want to do that. We say Vihaya Ka'asher, and it was at the time when Ka'asher Allah Achashverosh or whatever. So that would tell you in Hebrew a forward-looking word Vihaya, but telling you that it was back in history. And I always thought to myself that maybe the reasoning of the Anshe Knesset Gdola is that when a person is living in the past, that illustrates a time or of trauma, of tzar. When a person actually is looking forward, when your son will ask you in the future, what is this? You'll tell him it's looking forward into the future. That it indicates something which is happy, which causes a person to be able to be forward looking. What a tremendous lesson in creating easy times or easier times out of difficult times by forcing a forward-looking lens. Now, the Anshe Knesset taught us that Vayihi is only Lashon Tzar. So each time we have the word Vayihi in a happy time, everyone asks what's going on. Why does it say it in a negative tone? So Vayihi b'shalach paro et ha'am makes no sense. That should be that should be positive. And one of the answers that they give is that after everything that the Jews had been through in Egypt, when they were given permission to leave, one would have imagined that they would have left. Says the pasuk in a lashon of tsar, in a way of pain, that it required Vayihi b'shalach Paro ta'am. Paro needed to almost force them out of his country because they'd gotten so comfortable there that they were unable to leave of their own volition, of their own accord at that stage of the game. Anyway, let's continue. Vayihi b'Achashverosh, and it wasn't days of Achashverosh. Sorry. Yeah, and the one example was, and it wasn't days of Achashverosh. What do you see? What was the negative thing that came afterwards? Hava Haman. After that, we get introduced to this, diabolically anti-Semitic character known as Haman. Where do we find that? That's the beginning of Sefer Ruth, all right, that we read on Shavuot. On the days, it wasn't days Shifot HaShoftim. Literally, it means when the judges were judging. Now, there's different periods in the Jewish people. You have Moshe Rabbeinu, you have Yoshua. That's called the time of the Nevi'im. But if you look, what do you have Yoshua? After Sefer Yoshua is Sefer Shoftim. And in Shoftim, you have many different Shoftim. Gidon, etc., Yiftach, different levels of the spectrum. But there's different Shoftim that rule the Jewish people, judges. And the opening line is, and it was in the days, Shifot HaShoftim, where the judges were judging. And the Chachamim explained that it was in the days of the judging judges that people would judge the judges. So again, it was a Lashon Tsar. It was a difficult time. But the Gemara goes in a much more literal route, and it says, what was the difficulty about that time that we called it Vayehi? Havara'av. There was a time of tremendous famine. In fact, the famine is what precipitated the unfolding story of Ruth, if you remember correctly, guys. You remember that? Right? What happens? Avimelech, Elimelech and his two sons, Machlon and Kilion, right? He's the judge, but the people are starving, and he's like supporting everybody. So he decides, I can't do this anymore. I'm out of here. So he leaves and he goes to the non-Jewish land, Step Philistine. There he finds two daughters-in-law for his children, Ruth and Orpah. Okay, but there's a terrible famine. So in the end, Machlon, Kilion, and Elimelech die. Ruth and Naomi come back, and because she's starving, the two of them are starving, she has to go collect in the fields. Where does she go collect? In the field of Boaz. Boaz meets Ruth. They get married. The Talmud says that Boaz actually passes away the next day, but they have relations that night, Boaz and Ruth. And from that night, Boaz and Ruth actually become the forerunners of David HaMelech and Mashiach, as the end of Sefer Ruth ends off. Okay, so it was a difficult time, therefore it said Vayihi. Vayihi ki yechela adam larov. When mankind started to become a tremendous amount, larov, to increase. Where is that talking about? In the story of the flood. Hashem looked down and he saw how terrible the people were. This Gemara always bothered me. I understand Vayihi b'Achashverosh, that you want to lead in because we're in Masechet Megillah. But why would we bring B'imei Shefot HaShoftim, which is Ruth, before a pasuk in the actual Torah, which is about Noach? Vayihi ki echel adam larov. I never understood that. Either way, let's carry on. Vayihi ben soa mikedem, says the pasuk, and it was when he traveled mikedem. Havane, what did the people say when they traveled from the east? Over here it means from the east of Gan Eden, where they were chased out from the Garden of Eden. What did the people do after that point? Right, they went. They had the story of the flood. After the flood, again, they traveled mikedem. Interestingly enough, we find a derasha when it comes to Avraham and Lot. It says he traveled mikedem, and Rashi points out, he quotes the lashon of the Gemara. What does it mean, mikedem? Mikadmo shel olam. They were traveling from Kadmo shel olam, from the preceder of the world, i.e., it was a dedicated journey away from God. So again, a negative thing. Let's build us a city and a tower, and they decided to fight against Borei Olam. Vayivi me Amrafel, and it was in the days of Amrafel. This is the story of the 4 kings and the 5 kings. Asu milchama. They waged war. I loved always this idea as well. There's 4 kings. What do we care about them? We don't. The 5 kings. What do we care about them? We don't. And yet it says Vayihi. Why? Asu milchama. Hakadosh Baruch Hu hates war in any of its forms, even between random nations. And how do we know that that's true and that's not just Shlomo Farhi making a derasha on the words Asu Milchama Anavayehi? Because we find that in the end of times, in Yeshaya, it says that when Mashiach comes, Lo Yisa Goy El Goy Herev, Velo Yilmedu Od Milchama. One nation will not lift up against another nation a sword. They won't teach war anymore. They won't make war-like implements anymore. They're going to beat the swords, into plowshares, etc., etc. Who's Goy El Goy? Doesn't say. The idea that there should be a lack of shalom in this world, where all human beings are God's children, bothers Hakadosh Baruch Hu tremendously, and therefore, it's a sad thing that there is war. That's war being made. And it was when Yoshua was in Yericho. You see that Yoshua had to have his sword drawn. So therefore, it's a sad lashon of Vayihi. Vayihi kasher zaken Shmuel. And it wasn't Shemuel is old. The sons that he tried to appoint to take over him, they did not follow in his ways. And it was that David succeeded in everything that he did, and then that sounds like a good thing, but we follow up right away. Shaul David, and Shaul eyed David. He couldn't take his eyes off of his success, and that caused for a tremendous animosity between Shaul and David to the point where Shaul begins to hunt David like an animal. He dedicates all of his time and resources to try to kill David because he thinks David is trying to usurp the throne, which is not the case at all, but he's taken over by, the Pasuk says, by a Ruach Ra'ah, by a bad spirit. Some people say Ruach Ra'ah is a bad spirit. Some people say some form of depression, of mental illness, caused or precipitated by this jealousy, by this anger. But whatever it is, you see a Vayihi, which is a negative language. Now, again, I'm just pointing out the Gemara's original premise is that Vayihi is always bad. So that causes us to take a pasuk, Vayihi David L'chol Derachav Maskil. What's the end of that pasuk? Anyone know? We should know from Saturday night. Vayihi David L'chol Derachav Maskil. Oh, actually, it says it here in brackets. Va'amunai imo, and God is with him. How's that a negative thing? So the Gemara understood, since we said Vayihi always states a negative, we then looked for what the negative was, and we found it in Vayihi Shaul or Yenet David, that caused an Ayin Hara. What's an interesting thing, Sarah, can I trouble you to bring me the Gatorade? What's an interesting thing is that we say in the Tefillah that was composed actually, like we said, by Anshe Knesset Agdolah, Gomel Hasadim Tovim, that Borei Olam, he grants good kindnesses. So everyone asks, what is that extra word? Chasadim Tovim, good kindnesses. Kindnesses are good. Why do we have to say Gomel Chasadim Tovim? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'akol nהיה baro. Right? Why do we have to say good kindnesses? And the answer is because, yes, there are kindnesses that actually exact a toll and a price from us. So sometimes a person might make a lot of money in business and develop, different set of friends, and his wife and children, not used to the affluence, wind up becoming, sucked into the world, the rat race of physicality. And the guy finds himself 5 years after his lucky day. Now he has all the money in the world, but his family's falling apart. He's about to get divorced from his wife. His children, are on drugs because they fell in with these friends. You understand what I'm saying? So Hakadosh Baruch Hu, if God wants to grant you a kindness, He can grant you a kindness which is Gomer Chasadim Tovim, that the kindness should remain exclusively good. So that's really what we're witnessing here. David, he was successful in everything that he did. God was with him. But for whatever reason, God decided that I'm going to give David chesed, I'm be with him. But there's something here that needs to happen to him, and that is that he needs to suffer through this process with Shaul. In fact, much of David's life follows this template. He is incredibly lucky and simultaneously incredibly unlucky. It's a wild trip, the life of David. And our rabbis explain that David's purpose in this world was to be able to serve God through suffering, through difficulty. And he achieves such a great level of success in his mission that God blesses him with all sorts of blessings. But that does not stop his mission, which is to serve God through difficulty. So he gets all the zechuyot, all the wonderful berachot that he gets. But he never departs because a person can't outrun their destiny. And David HaMelech's job was to be able to be Ne'im Zimerot Yisrael, the singer of Am Yisrael, at the same time to go through very difficult times. And it was when David HaMelech sat in his home, David HaMelech told him right after that, Hashem said to him, Rak ata lo tibnei abayit. Now, just for perspective, what's the Gemara talking about over here? David HaMelech realizes, 1 second, Borei Olam, God does not have a house. I'm building myself a house, a palace, as a king should, and I have a place to dwell, but Borei Olam does not. And it's interesting, David HaMelech issues a very powerful statement. He says to God, Imavo el oil beti, Imered le'eretz Yisuai, Im eten shnat le'enai, La'afapai tinuma, Ad emsa makom la'Hashem. David says, I'm not going to live in my house. I'm not going to sleep. I'm not going to rest. I'm not going to, until I find a place for God to be able to have his Bet HaMikdash. And indeed, David actually finds a place, a plot, to be able to buy. David buys Harabayit. Okay? He buys this place with the intention of building the Bet HaMikdash. But then God tells him, Rak ata lo tibnei bayit. You're not going to build the Bet HaMikdash. Your son's going to build it, but not you. Why? Because the one who builds the Bet HaMikdash can't be a person who waged war. And David HaMelech was constantly at war with the Philistine, with the Moavim, with the enemies of the Jewish people to save the Jews from their enemies, where they were downtrodden before Shaul, during Shaul. So David successfully wages war. But Hashem says it can't be that a house of shalom, right, should be built by a person who's tainted with so much blood, even justified blood. So the house is going to be built by Shlomo. Interestingly and ironically enough, the name Shlomo itself, the root, it means shalem, which means perfection. It also represents Yerushalem, which is the ability to see Shlemut, which is where the Beit HaMikdash is built, and also represents Shalom, that during the time of Shlomo HaMelech, during his reign, there were no wars whatsoever. Shlomo did not need to wage war like his father did back in the day. Let's continue. The Gemara continues and says, okay, I hear your point about all the Vayehis. However, challenge. What are you talking about? The Pasuk says, Vayehi b'yom hashemini, was on the 8th day, when they erected the temple. We just had Parashat Shemini. That was the 8th day, where they brought the Korbanot, did all these great things, and look, it was a good thing. And it says, Vayehi boker yom echad. Someone actually asked this in the class last week. Doesn't it say? And I said, we're going to get to it. Vayehi erev, Vayehi boker, it was evening, it was morning, it was the first day. So you see, Vayehi also indicates positive things. It's not only a negative thing. On that, the Gemara says, you're right. It's true that on the 8th day, the Bet HaMikdash, the temple, was inaugurated. But on that day was the day that Nadav and Avihu, the two sons of Aaron, they died. And therefore, we say Vayihi. Gemara says, 1 second. Okay, first of all, we're still left over, if you remember, Vayerev Vayivoke Yom Echad. So we did not answer, by answering Nadav and Avihu, we did not answer the fact that Vayerev Vayivoke Yom Echad is a correct one. Okay? Now, the Gemara, what was it doing by trying to compare those two? It was trying to communicate that, sorry, I skipped a line. Vitanya, Haita Simcha, Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Keyom, right? Oto Hayom, on that day, it was so much joy, it was as joyous as Kiyom Shnivru B'Shamayim Haaretz. Because in both cases it says Vayihi Bayom, Vayihi, Vayer, Vayivoker. So that expression of Vayihi indicates that they're joint, they're linked. And you see that such a day, the creation of the Beit HaMikdash, was like the creation of the world itself. And if that's the case, it's a happy day. And the Gemara's answer is, it's true, but on that day, Shachiv, Nadav and Avihu. Nadav and Avihu passed away. By the way, the Gemara is not just saying, it says Vayihi here, it says Vayihi there, it must be happy, as much simcha as the day of creation. You know, why the Gemara choose that? We just found you 400 Vayihis that were negative. Right? Did anyone realize that? You're saying, look, Vayihi or Shemini must be happy. What's the proof? It's happy because, look, in the other place, it says Vayihi, and that was the day of creation. How did the Gemara know to compare Vayihi Vayom HaShemini to Vayihi Erev Vayivoker, and not to all the other Vayihis that were said? And the answer actually is that it's not just a random connection of Vayihi Vayihi. The Chachamim explain that there are 15 things that were required in order to be able to build the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, and there are also 15 things that were created in the process of creation. And in each one of those things, Chazal tell us, on a mystical level, they were creating a world. So the Mishkan is actually designed to be a replica of the genesis of our universe. Fascinating insight, if you remember as well, because what is Bayom HaShemini on the 8th day? What was the 8th day? What day does that turn out to be? It turns out to be Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Now, there's a machloket on which day the world was created. One opinion says Rosh Chodesh Nisan. One opinion says Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. Machloket, right? On when the world was created. In the end, the Gemara seems to resolve the situation by saying one of them was describing creation in deed, and one of them was describing creation in machshava. On the 1st of Nisan, the world was created. It was Allah b'machshava. God decided to create the world. Now, that's not like you and me, that when we have a thought, like I think I want to go get donuts, it doesn't mean anything. It's just a random thought. It can have no meaning to it. God's thoughts are the blueprints of his creation. So he thinks something and he thinks he wants to do it, and the ratzon that happens transforms that thought into actual thing. Okay? So on this day of creation is also the creation of this Beit HaMikdash. Again, it's subject for further study, but therefore we find that it's a day of such happiness and creation, like the first day. Answers the Gemara, Hashachiv Nadav Avihu, but Nadav and Avihu passed away. So I always found in this Gemara such tremendous musar. We just compared the building of the Mikdash, of the temple. We just compared it to the building of the entire world, right? And therefore, the Gemara says the day was so joyous for God, it was as joyous as the day that He created the world. So how can it be a bad thing? What's the Gemara's answer? What do you mean? Shachiv Nadav Avihu. Nadav and Avihu died. Who cares? Hashem created the world. The Jews created Beit HaMikdash. They created a mechanism to connect to God. You see, we don't understand the power, the impact of mitatan shel tzadikim, of the death of the righteous. In the Beit Knesset, one of the most moving piyutim is a piyut that we read on Yom Kippur, where we read the story. They have a poem written of the mitat shene v'nei Aaron, right? The two sons of Aaron. And the Chachamim explain, why do we read that piyut on Yom Kippur, because it says if someone feels bad about the passing of a tzaddik, that can be mechaper, bring kapara on the whole generation. So you see that in the Gemara's view, even if it was a day as happy as the day of creation itself, if two great tzaddikim, Nadav and Avihu, passed away, that is enough to say that this day is a sad day. Unbelievable. But obviously we don't understand the gift that tzaddikim are to the world to be able to understand that Shachiv Nadav Avihu is an answer to that question. Okay. Ask the Gemara, 1 second. Fine, you answered me on Shemini. Factive, now we're going to throw the bookcase at you. Factive, was 480th year. Factive, right? And it says over there, in that year he built a Beit HaMikdash. Happy thing. Factive, and it was when Yaakov saw Rachel. Happy thing. That's when he met her, he fell in love with her. Factive, on each of the days of creation, it says, and it was, there's many other instances that we find exactly this concept of Vayehi, that it's a positive thing. So what is this expression that we're taught from the Anshe Knesset Agdola that we've been defending all until now? That Vayehi is always a negative thing. Answers the Gemara Amar Rav Ashi. Kol Vayehi Ika. Every Vayehi, there are some like this and some like that. There's some that are good and some that are bad. However, what we were talking about when we said that Vayehi is always bad is when we find the words together, Vayehi bimei, and it was in the days of. Those are in Lashon Tzar. Says the Gemara, okay, well, how many of those are there? Chamisha Vayehi bimei havu. There were 5 times where we find those two words together, Vayehi bimei Achashverosh, Vayehi bimei Shvot HaShoftim, we already said those two. Vayehi bimei Amraphel, we said that one as well, the time of the 4 kings and the 5 kings. Vayehi bimei Achaz, it was in the times of Achaz. During the time of Achaz, there was a war, internecine fighting between the Jewish people, but Achaz was also a terribly wicked king, and they're fighting against. The Jews were fighting against themselves, the kingdom of Yehudah fighting against the kingdom of Israel. And finally, Vayehi bimei Yehoyakim, and it was in the days of Yehoyakim, that Yehoyakim was the king who presided over the time that the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. So we say it was in the days of Yehoyakim. So each one of the times that we find in the Torah and Nevim Ketuvim, Vayehi bimei, it's always a negative, there's always a negative thing. Okay, now the Gemara, we're on teachings from Rabbi Levi. Says the Gemara, another idea. Amar Rabbi Levi. Rabbi Levi says, we learned the tradition, a concept that was handed down from our rabbis, from our fathers. Amot ve'amatzia achim havu. We don't find it anywhere in the Pesukim. We don't have a source for it, but it was a tradition that was always handed down that we were taught, that Amot and Amatzia, these two people, achim havu, they were brothers. The rabbis had to tell us that these two guys were brothers. Why was that important? What are they, blues brothers? Gemara answers, Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani said over the name of Yonatan, Kol kala she'itznua b'beit hamia. Anytime you have a kala that is strict with the modesty that she displays while she's in her father-in-law's house, okay, this is highly relevant in the city of Deal, New Jersey. Okay, you have a daughter-in-law married to your son, and now she feels very at home in your house, and she walks around and she's not strict because she's home, so she's not necessarily modest, but she's not in her own parents' house. She's in your parents' house. So there are other men that are not related to her that are seeing her perhaps dressed in a way where she should not be dressed, and she would not be dressed except for the fact that she feels like she's at home. And the Gemara says, what does she get for being strict on the modesty in her father-in-law's house? Kings and prophets come from her. Minala, and then we know this, Tamar. This pasuk is one of the most difficult pasukim in all of Torah. The pasuk tells us that Yehuda was traveling on the road and he sees a woman on the road. Vayachshevea lezona, vayar'ea, he saw her. Vayachshevea lezona, and he thought that she was zona, she was a harlot. Now, what's interesting is as well is the midrashim, the gemarot all talk about this idea of Yehuda. What's going on here with Yehuda? And the line is the Gemara. The line of the Gemara of Chazal is malach dechafo, which means an angel pushed him. Now, I don't know. You remember when you were in school back in the day? You turned off the lights in the classroom. Teacher asks you, what happened? Oh, someone pushed me. I didn't tell you to turn off the lights. That's the Gemara I was saying. He finds this woman, Tamar malach dechafo. What's going on? So the word malach dechafo on a more mature level actually doesn't mean that he was shoved by a malach on Tamar, but rather that there was an angel of God, a messenger of God, that caused for this relationship to actually come to fruition. Why? Because from that relationship, if you remember in the Torah, she becomes pregnant from Yehuda, and in the end, they say to her, what do you mean? You were supposed to wait for the last child of Yehuda because of Yibum. The first two boys died. They thought that she married outside of her Zikah responsibilities, which actually she in the time of the beta of the Torah, before the Matan Torah, Yibum was carried out not just by the brothers in order to stand up a name for the person that passed away, but it was carried out by any family member. So that was also a valid, Zikah member. Anyway, so Malach Dechafo, that it should happen through him. Why? Because she then gets taken out to be burned, and instead of embarrassing Yehuda, she says, whoever these objects are, he'd given her objects as a collateral. Whoever objects these are, let them recognize them because it's to him that I'm pregnant. Anyway, Yehuda says those are mine. He could have kept his mouth shut. Tzadikam mimeni. God looks down and he sees Tamar the way she is. He sees Yehuda the way he admits it. Neither one of them needed to humiliate themselves in that way. And God saw that the value in those two people, and he caused that the two children that came from that union, Peretz and Zarach, from that child came David HaMelech. But the Gemara now is going to explain. So how do we see that that's connected to the modesty that she showed in her family, in her father's house? Answers the Gemara. He thought she was zona because her face was covered. Answers the Gemara. He thought that she was a harlot. Answers the Gemara. No, that's not what it means. It means not that her face was covered now. Now her face was not covered. But because she covered her face all those years when she was at home in her father-in-law's house, married to the first two sons of Yehuda, so now Yehuda had no idea. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know what she looked like. Zachta, so therefore he didn't recognize who she was. And Zachta v'yatzu mimena melachim and nevi'im. So you see over here an extreme level of modesty in Tamar. And that resulted in Yehuda not recognizing her now. And because of that, the Melachim, the kings, and the Nevi'im came from her. Now, lest you think that this is a random idea, I want to point out just something quick and interesting about this. Why are they rewarded with kings and prophets? And the answer is that both a Melech and a Navi require the core trait of anivut, of modesty and of humility. Because a king that doesn't have that trait of modesty, where everything is about showing off an ego and it's all about me, that king can become a megalomaniac ruler, a narcissistic ruler that's capable of killing his own people for his own aims, right? So therefore, it's important that if God wants to bring kings to the Jewish people, that they should come from people that are modest. Same thing with Nevi'im. You have a Navi that witnesses a Nivu'ah that they don't want to share because it's going to impact their popularity. It's going to impact their standing with the people. That it's too they don't like it's too harsh. Etc. etc. The person can distort the Nivu'ah. So therefore, that modesty is present. And by the way, as we know, David, that is the symbol of all kings, and Moshe, that is the symbol of all Nevi'im, are two people about whom it says that they had peak anava, right? That they had the highest forms of anava. David HaMelech says, Anochi tola'at v'lo ish, I'm a worm and not a man. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, V'anachnu man, we are nothing, ki talinu alenu. So you see again this concept of modesty being linked in to kings and prophets. Says the Gemara, how do we know that they had kings and prophets? Milachim mi David. Milachim we know came from David, and that is taught to us directly in the pasuk from Ruth, where it traces David HaMelech all the way back to Peretz, to the son of Yehudah. And Nevi'im, how do we know that Nevi'im come from this tradition of modesty of a woman in her father-in-law's house? Nevi'im da Amar Rabbi Levi, Rabbi Levi taught, Masoret bi'adenu me'avotenu, we have a teaching in our hands. Amotz ve'amatzia achim hayu. These Amotz and Amatzia are brothers. Uchtiv, and it says, Chazon Yeshayahu ben Amotz, that Yeshayahu was the son of Amotz. So Amatzia, we know, is a king, one of the kings of Israel. So we know Melachim come from Amatzia. Where do we find that a Navi came specifically from this relationship? The answer is, if Amotz and Amatzia are brothers, and we know that Yeshaya, one of the greatest Nevi'im, was Ben Amotz, and Amatzia is a king, he must come from the tribe of David, in which case Amotz is also the prophet, is her descendant. Now, it's interesting, there's two different ways of learning this. One way of understanding this Gemara is that the proof was that we found the Navi, and who's the Navi? Yeshayahu. But the commentators actually add a different perspective, that whenever it says Chazon Yeshayahu ben Amotz, if it includes the father in the Chazon, which is the vision, then it's saying that both of these people were men of vision. Otherwise, it would have just said Chazon Yeshayahu. But because it says Ben Amotz, that indicates that the father was also a Navi. Now, it's interesting to me that those commentators feel the need to go down that route, because whether or not Amotz was, his son was. Like, we don't have a proof that Amotz's father was a Navi, right? So whether the dice landed on Amotz or the dice landed on Yeshaya, you see that Melachim and Nevi'im come from such a union. The other interesting thing I want to point out before we move on is that it seems asymmetrical. Melachim mi David. So how many kings came from Tamar? All of them. Nevi'im, look, there's a teaching, Amotz and Amatzia brothers, and the son of Amotz is Yeshaya, and Yeshaya ben Amotz, so maybe one of them was a Navi, maybe both of them were the Navi, right? All of the kings, and let's find one Navi that came from Tamar. Hard to understand. Maybe that's why the commentators felt the need to learn Yeshayahu ben Amotz, because if it was just Yeshaya, you would say it's an outlier. But if you could see at least that there were numerous, there was two, a plural of Nevi'im, you have Amotz and you have Yeshayahu. Let's do with the last teaching of Rabbi Levi, and then we'll wrap. The Amar Rabbi Levi taught. We learned an idea from our fathers, a tradition that was passed down. Mekom Aaron eno min amidah. The space of the Aaron eno min amidah does not take up from the space of the Kodesh HaKodashim, which sounds like a strange thing. We'll see what that means in a minute. Tanya Namiach, you have a brighter that says the same thing. Aaron she'asa Moshe, the ark that Moshe Rabbeinu built, yesh lo 10 amot lekol ruach, has 10 amot on each side between it and the walls of the Beit HaMikdash. Uchtiv, and what does it say? Ulefnei hadivir 20 ma'orech, and in the front of the devir of this wall of between the Kodesh Kodashim was 20 amot long and 20 amot wide. It was a square. So what does that mean? It means that it's 20 amot by 20 amot. So therefore, The entirety of the space is 20 by 20. And it says, Kenafa kiruv echad 10 amot, ukenafa kiruv echad 10 amot. The wings of the cherubs were 10 feet, were 10 amot, and the wings of the other cherub were 10 amot. What's that telling you? That really there's a tremendous amount of space that these kiruvim on top of the Aron took up. And if that's the case, there's really no space in the Kodesh HaKodashim to be taken up by the Aron at all. Because if the midah of the Aron is 20, and the midah, not the box itself, of the kiruvim, okay? And if the midah of the space, of the box, of the space was 20 by 20, then there's no place for the Aron to actually exist in that space. Aron gufeh hecha havekai. So where was the Aron? Where did the Aron stand then, if that's the case? Elalav shmamina. We learn from here, benes haya omed. The Bet HaMikdash, the ark itself, it stood without taking up any room. It was a nes. Now, one has to understand what we're talking about over here. Just let's kind of recalibrate, before we end. That means that there's a physical object, the Aron. You take it out of the Kodesh HaKodashim, you could see the size of it. You bring it into the Kodesh HaKodashim, you could see the size of it. All of a sudden, you take this object, which should take up the whole room, and then you put it in, and it's in the middle of the room, and the room is still the same size around it, 10 amot on either side. How is that possible? So the idea is that in the Bet HaMikdash was Enom and Amidah. Bet HaMikdash was called, it was not according to its size. What that means is that it was above space, in fact. That's the idea. Now, earlier, I think it was Stanley that mentioned that in the Bet HaMikdash, when they would have the gathering of all the Jewish people, they would come for the holiday, they would be standing man to man. There would be no space as they stood. I don't know if you've ever been to the Kotel for Birkat Kohanim. So I used to go there, and you're standing wall to wall, and there's a point where the crowd moves, and if you're stuck between two people, your legs are not even on the ground, but you don't fall because you're sandwiched between the crowd. That's how crowded it was. Imagine that times many, 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 many more. So omdim tzifufim, when they would stand, they would be tzafuf, they would be crowded. But then came the time and they would say Hashem's name, and every one of those people was able to, what do we do when we hear God's name in the temple? They would bow. Now, you take up only about 1 foot, the width of your feet, right, when you stand. When you lie down, you take up 5 feet, 6 feet, however tall you are. So that's a physical impossibility. And yet, in the Bet HaMikdash, omdim tzifufim, when they would stand, they were crowded. Mishtachavim, but when they would bow, rivachim, they had room. So the Bet HaMikdash was a place that there was no space. And again, this is a very deep idea. I'm just going to throw you a little bit of a concept, and then we'll end. The Chazal tell us that the Bet HaMikdash was the place where Shamayim Va'aretz, where the heavens kissed the earth. Now, what that means is that the interplay between Shamayim and Aretz is this place. So therefore, the Korbanot, these things, these actions, these services, which are intensely spiritual, could be carried out in a physical domain and yet translate onto the spiritual side of the continuum. So the idea that the place itself had physical attributes which were limited in time and in space, and also had spiritual attributes which were not limited in time and space. Even just a cursory understanding of science will tell you that time is relative, right? That was Einstein's theory of relativity. That time is relative, and that time actually depends on a plethora of issues, on gravity, etc., etc. That time moves more slowly on the moon. That time moves at a different speed in another place. So ostensibly, there would be places in space where time would not just slow down, but would completely stop. Or there would be time in another place the time might work on another planet or solar system where time might move faster than it moves on this earth. So the idea that the Beit HaMikdash at that nexus point would have attributes that were above space and time, there would be elements of it that would defy the laws of physics. As an example, when they would burn the korbanot on the Mizbeach, there would be a plume of smoke that would ascend to the heavens in a straight line. The wind is blowing in Jerusalem like crazy, and the smoke doesn't dissipate even one drop. Not in the walls of the temple, even as it rose out into the air. That's an impossibility. And yet there were elements of the daily practice in the Beit HaMikdash which were open miracles. There's meat being slaughtered by the ranch, and there's not a single fly. If you ever went to an abattoir, you ever went to a slaughterhouse, the stench is overpowering. In the Beit HaMikdash, there's no smell. These are physical impossibilities, but they were on display on a regular basis in the Beit HaMikdash, which was this crossover point. So the Gemara over here tells us that the Aron was able to occupy space without occupying any space. It was in a constant state of mishtachavim, revachim. Now, it's not that when you moved the Aron in, the room got bigger, right? It didn't get bigger. And when you took it out, the room got smaller. It didn't get smaller. It was there in its state, in a constant defying of the laws of our universe. And now a person really understands on a certain level why we mourn the temple. Because imagine a person is suffering through whatever they're going through, or they sinned in whatever way they sinned. They were really able to go to the Beit HaMikdash and instantaneously plug into the reality of God. Could you imagine that? You're having problems in emunah, in your business, in your marriage, and your whatever. Person is disconnected from God. They just feel like, I'm just going to do whatever I want. And then you're faced with the fact that you can see with your own eyes that this is a miraculous place, that God is here in this building. God exists in our world. Instantaneously, that could cause a person to come to teshuvah. So that is an element of one of the things that we mourn about the lack in the Beit HaMikdash, that it was this unbelievable reset button. Okay? All right, let's end here. We'll continue from Rabbi Yonatan Patach Le on Tuesday.